I never expected that a simple request from my son would push me into the center of a psychological storm that none of us were prepared for. And before I take you inside this unbelievable journey, make sure you stay till the end because every twist in this story reveals something about human behavior that we often overlook. So please listen carefully, and if this story resonates with you at any point, don't forget to share your thoughts because your voice matters more than you think. And now let me tell you what really happened on the day my son sent me to a hotel to meet his in-laws, a moment that appeared normal from the outside but slowly unfolded into something so disturbing, so emotionally charged, and so deeply connected to the hidden psychology of relationships that even now when I think about it my heart tightens as if my mind is pulling me back into a memory I never wanted to relive. Because everything started that morning when my son stood in front of me with an unusual hesitation in his eyes, the kind that children have when they want something but are afraid to say it, and he finally told me that his wife's parents were coming from out of town and needed a place to rest before a family dinner. And instead of offering them a room in our home like we always did, he wanted me to go to a nearby hotel to handle a small misunderstanding they supposedly had with the reservation. And I remember asking him why he couldn't go himself, why he needed me there, but his answer wasn't convincing. It felt rehearsed, like he had prepared it earlier, and though he kept saying it was nothing, just a simple favor, something in his tone made me uneasy. But I didn't question him further because parents often ignore their intuition when their children ask for help, believing that love requires cooperation even when logic whispers otherwise. So I agreed and left for the hotel thinking it would take no more than an hour, unaware that I was walking directly into a psychological trap woven by miscommunication, suppressed emotions, and fragile egos. And when I reached the hotel lobby everything looked ordinary. The front desk staff smiled, the scent of strong coffee drifted from the cafe on the left, and the elevators chimed softly every few minutes. But behind that pleasant normality something darker was brewing, something that neither the hotel staff nor I could have predicted. And when I finally located my in-laws sitting stiffly on the lobby sofa, their faces unusually tense, I felt as if the air around them was heavier than the rest of the room. So I greeted them politely, expecting a warm response, but instead they looked at each other first, exchanging a silent dialogue before acknowledging me. And instantly I knew something was wrong because their behavior wasn't just awkward, it was defensive, like people hiding a secret. And when I asked what happened, they didn't answer directly. Instead they began circling around vague comments about being disrespected, unheard, ignored, and then suddenly I found myself listening to a flood of emotional complaints, fears, frustrations, insecurities, and grievances they had been carrying not just toward my son but toward their own daughter, my daughter-in-law, and with every sentence they spoke I could feel the psychological tension building like a rope being pulled too tightly, because what they were saying wasn't simply criticism, it was emotional exhaustion, years of feeling undervalued, years of pretending everything was fine when in reality everything was breaking. And as I sat with them the situation shifted from a simple hotel misunderstanding into a full psychological confession, the kind people only reveal when they reach their breaking point, and within minutes they told me something that shook me so deeply that I momentarily forgot how to respond, because they said they wanted their daughter to divorce my son, and the reason wasn't money, misbehavior, or scandal, but something far more complex. They believed that both families were breaking emotionally because everyone kept pretending everything was perfect while silently suffering behind closed doors, and they said the hotel incident wasn't the trigger but the final drop in a bucket that had been overflowing for years. And hearing this shattered me because for the first time I realized how blind we had been as parents, how little we understood about the psychological strain our children were carrying in their marriage, how deeply small misunderstandings had cut into their hearts, and how dangerous it is when families suppress problems instead of addressing them. And as they kept talking I felt as if their words were peeling away layers of truth, exposing wounds none of us had dared to look at, and suddenly I was caught between loyalty to my son, empathy for my daughter-in-law, and compassion for her parents, and all three emotions pulled me in different directions, leaving me unable to speak. And they told me that 1 hour earlier they had already argued with my son over the phone, an argument that escalated so quickly that they felt humiliated, unheard, and emotionally crushed, and that's when they decided that divorce was the only solution, not because they hated him but because they believed the marriage was emotionally damaging both families beyond repair. And in that moment I realized this wasn't just a conflict, it was a psychological unraveling of two families who never truly understood each other. and as they expressed their pain I knew I had a responsibility not to defend my son blindly, not to blame their daughter, but to understand the psychological roots of what brought us to this moment. Because marriage doesn't fall apart suddenly, it collapses slowly, silently, under the weight of unspoken expectations, emotional fatigue, and cultural pressures. And as the clock ticked past the 1-hour mark I knew that if someone didn't intervene with empathy, honesty, and deep psychological understanding, this family would fracture permanently. And that is where the real story begins, where the real transformation starts. Because what I did next changed everything, not just for them but for myself as well. And if you want to know how this story unfolds, stay with me, because what comes next will reveal truths about relationships, resentment, healing, and human emotion that many people never understand until it is too late. As I sat there in that hotel lobby, listening to every trembling word spoken by my in-laws, I realized something painful yet undeniable. People don't reach the point of demanding divorce unless something inside them has been breaking quietly for a very long time, and the more they talked, the more I understood how deeply they felt betrayed, not just by my son but by the idea of marriage itself, as if the promises made years ago had dissolved slowly through emotional neglect and unspoken disappointments. And I found myself wondering how many moments of misunderstanding had piled up like invisible stones until the weight finally crushed them, because they weren't speaking like enemies. They were speaking like exhausted human beings who had loved too much, tolerated too much, and finally reached a threshold their hearts could no longer carry. And as I listened, I noticed the father's hands trembling subtly, a tremor that revealed a depth of pain words alone could never capture, while the mother's eyes carried the kind of sadness you see in people who feel they have failed despite giving everything they had. And in that moment I realized this wasn't an attack on my son at all but a desperate cry for psychological relief, the kind people only express when they feel trapped between loyalty and survival. And when I asked them gently why they hadn't shared any of this earlier, the mother looked at me with a tired half-smile and said something that pierced straight through me. She said that people often hide their suffering because they don't want to be seen as burdens, and that silence becomes a habit until it becomes a prison. And I felt her words settling into my chest like a truth I had been avoiding for years, because deep down even I knew my son wasn't perfect. He carried his own emotional wounds, insecurities, and unresolved childhood patterns that he never learned to express, and I realized how easily those patterns could trigger misunderstandings in his marriage. But I hadn't expected it to escalate to this degree, and the more they revealed, the more I understood that their daughter had been suffering quietly too, not because she didn't love my son but because she felt she had no emotional space to breathe, no room to speak without fearing judgment or anger. And the father then told me that the phone argument earlier wasn't about the hotel at all, it was about an accumulation of moments where they felt dismissed, unheard, and treated as outsiders rather than family. And hearing that tore something inside me, because family is supposed to be a place where people feel valued, respected, and emotionally safe, yet somehow both families had become the opposite, a place of tension and unspoken fear. And I wished desperately that I could rewind time and help them communicate better, because communication is the heartbeat of relationships, and without it everything slowly suffocates. And I noticed as they spoke that they weren't angry. They were heartbroken, and heartbreak changes the way people see the world. It distorts reality, magnifies small disruptions into unbearable burdens, and convinces people that escape is the only path to peace. And when they told me they believed divorce would free their daughter from the emotional weight she had been carrying, I felt a wave of conflict flooding my mind, because I knew I had to defend my son yet also acknowledge their truth. And I couldn't deny that sometimes love alone is not enough to hold two people together if emotional understanding is missing. But I also knew that ending a marriage in the heat of emotional pain could cause irreversible regret. So I took a deep breath and asked them if they would allow me to understand their daughter's perspective before anything final was decided, and they agreed, though reluctantly. And in that moment I felt a shift inside myself, a sense of responsibility awakening, as if I had been chosen to become the bridge between two families collapsing under their own fears. And before I could speak further, the father leaned closer and said something I will never forget. He said that marriage is not destroyed by big explosive events but by small daily wounds that go unnoticed, by dismissive tones, sarcastic remarks, broken expectations, emotional distance, and the constant feeling of not being prioritized. And as he said this I realized he was not only describing their daughter's pain but perhaps even his own marriage. The generational patterns passed silently from parent to child, shaping the way we love and the way we hurt without even realizing it, and suddenly I could see the entire psychological map of this situation unfolding in front of me. Decades of emotional habits intersecting, clashing, and producing chaos, and I knew then that if I didn't tread carefully, every word I said could either heal the situation or shatter it beyond repair. And as I watched them sitting there, drained and fragile, I felt a mix of compassion and fear tightening around my heart because they weren't demanding anything out of cruelty, they were begging for psychological relief, and that desperation made me realize how deeply this had affected them. And at that moment my phone buzzed. It was my son calling again, probably to check if I had reached the hotel, but I didn't answer, not because I didn't want to talk to him but because I needed clarity before I allowed any further confrontation, so I silenced the phone and continued listening, giving them the emotional space they clearly needed. And after nearly an hour of conversation I noticed the mother's voice softening slightly, as if sharing her pain had eased some of the weight she had been carrying. And that was when I realized something profound, something most people never understand. Sometimes people threaten divorce not because they want marriage to end but because they want the suffering to stop, because they want to feel seen, understood, valued, and emotionally safe. And when those needs are repeatedly unmet, the mind interprets separation as the only way to survive. And in that moment I saw their fear, their exhaustion, their longing for peace. And I knew I had to approach this situation not as a parent defending her son but as a human being trying to understand the psychological cracks forming in the foundation of two families. And so I leaned forward and told them gently that no final decision should be made while emotions are burning, that sometimes what looks like the end is actually a turning point. And I promised them that I would speak to my son not with anger but with the empathy and insight this situation demanded. And as we continued talking, the atmosphere slowly shifted from tension toward a fragile calm, but even then I could sense one more layer of truth hiding behind their words, something they hadn't yet revealed, something that would change everything once spoken. And I knew that once they told me the full truth, the direction of this story would no longer be the same, and that revelation was coming sooner than I expected, waiting just beneath the surface of their trembling silence, ready to rewrite everything I thought I understood about my son, their daughter, and the fragile psychology of marriage itself. The moment their silence grew heavier, I knew they were holding back something far more serious than emotional exhaustion, something that had been sitting beneath their words like a quiet storm waiting for the right moment to break. And as the father leaned back and exhaled slowly, I could see the weight of years pressing against his chest, the kind of pressure that shapes a person's entire outlook on life. And he finally said that what truly broke them wasn't the argument, wasn't the hotel confusion, and wasn't even the communication gap itself, but something far more intimate and unsettling, something that had happened months earlier and had been haunting their daughter silently. And when he paused as if choosing his words with extreme caution, I felt my heartbeat pick up because I knew whatever he was about to say would change the entire direction of this story. And after a long breath he revealed that their daughter had been struggling with an invisible emotional burden inside the marriage, a burden she couldn't express for fear of hurting my son or disrespecting our family. And they explained that she had been suppressing her emotional needs for so long that she began doubting her own worth, her confidence, her voice, questioning whether her existence in the marriage mattered at all. And it stunned me because I had never imagined her suffering could run this deep. But the mother's trembling voice confirmed the truth. She said her daughter often cried quietly at night, unable to tell anyone what triggered her loneliness or why she felt emotionally neglected even when surrounded by family. And hearing that cracked something inside me because I had always believed that my son, despite his flaws, carried a good heart. But now I wondered whether his emotional unavailability, his habit of shutting down when overwhelmed, had built walls she couldn't climb, walls she didn't know how to break without breaking herself. And as they explained further, I realized how subtle emotional neglect can be, how it doesn't always appear as cruelty or anger but sometimes is silence, distraction, avoidance, lack of reassurance, and small dismissive habits that seem harmless in the moment but accumulate until they make someone feel invisible. And the father described how their daughter had begun losing interest in her hobbies, withdrawing from social interactions, even hesitating to visit them because she didn't want to reveal her pain. And he said she didn't blame my son entirely. She believed both families had contributed to her emotional suffocation, and that truth pierced me deeply because I realized that perhaps in our efforts to maintain politeness, to respect their boundaries, or to avoid intruding, we had unintentionally created distance that felt like indifference. and the mother's voice cracked as she confessed that the most heartbreaking part was that their daughter still loved my son deeply, so deeply that she kept hoping things would change on their own. But love alone couldn't heal a heart that felt unheard, and as they spoke I felt a painful clarity rising within me, a realization that emotional suffering is often invisible until it erupts, and marriages fall apart not because love disappears but because people stop feeling emotionally safe with each other. And I knew my son wasn't intentionally hurting her. He simply didn't understand how his behavior affected her because he himself had grown up in a home where expressing emotions openly wasn't always encouraged, where silence was often mistaken for strength, and I realized how generational patterns quietly seep into relationships, shaping the way people love, argue, express, and withdraw. And as this understanding settled into my mind, I felt an urgent need to ask them what exactly had happened months earlier, the event that seemed to anchor all of this pain. And the father finally revealed that their daughter had experienced a severe emotional breakdown. Something she hid from my son because she feared he would either dismiss her feelings or misunderstand her intentions, and they told me she had reached a state where she felt she couldn't breathe inside her own marriage, where she felt like a guest in her own life, constantly adjusting, constantly apologizing, constantly trying to prove her worth while slowly losing her identity. And the mother added that she had begged them not to blame my son because she believed he himself was struggling emotionally and didn't know how to express love in the way she needed. But despite her protection, they couldn't watch their daughter collapse under silent emotional pressure any longer. And that's why the argument earlier had triggered such an explosive reaction. Because it wasn't about today, it was about every day that had passed without emotional healing. Every day she had tried to stay strong while feeling alone. Every day she had swallowed her pain believing marriage demanded endurance rather than communication. And hearing this made my eyes sting because I realized how little we truly know about the emotional battles people fight behind closed doors. And for the first time I felt a deep responsibility, not just as a mother but as a human being, to stop the cycle of silent suffering and bring truth into the open. And while we were speaking, I noticed the mother suddenly press a hand to her chest as if trying to steady her breath, and I immediately understood that this situation had pushed her to the limits of her emotional stability too, because parents often feel their children's pain as their own, carrying burdens they can't fix and wounds they can't heal, and I gently placed my hand on hers, assuring her that we would not let this marriage crumble without trying to mend the emotional fractures that had been ignored for far too long. And she looked at me with eyes full of uncertainty but also a flicker of hope, as if she wanted desperately to believe that healing was still possible. And at that moment I felt a shift inside myself, a determination forming like a quiet fire, because I knew this wasn't a battle between families but a battle against silence, against misunderstanding, against emotional habits passed down unknowingly through generations. And I vowed silently that if there was even a small chance of saving this relationship, I would help them find it, not by forcing anyone, not by denying anyone's pain, but by guiding them toward truth, empathy, and emotional understanding. And as this vow settled in my heart, the father leaned toward me again and said in a low voice that there was still one more truth they needed to share, one more detail that could change everything. But they were afraid of how I might react, and when I urged them gently to speak openly, the mother whispered that their daughter wasn't the only one suffering. My son had been hiding something too, something they had accidentally discovered, something that explained his defensiveness, his short temper, his emotional withdrawal, and his sudden argument earlier. And the moment she said this my entire body stiffened, because I realized the story I thought I understood was only half complete, and the other half, my son's half, was about to surface, carrying answers I wasn't prepared for but desperately needed if there was any hope left for this collapsing marriage. And that truth, when revealed, would expose the deepest psychological cracks in all of us. The moment they hinted that my son had been hiding something, a cold, unfamiliar fear tightened around my ribs. Because no matter how prepared you think you are as a parent, nothing truly prepares you for the possibility that your own child might be silently drowning in struggles you never noticed. And as the father leaned forward, his voice low and steady like someone revealing a truth too fragile to speak aloud, he explained that they had discovered something unexpected about my son weeks earlier when their daughter had gone to stay with them for a few days to clear her mind, and during that time my son had called her repeatedly. Not to argue or plead but in a tone of desperation that made them realize he was battling something deeper than marital tension. And they said that his voice often cracked during those calls, not with anger but with fear, A fear that he would lose her not because she didn't love him but because he could not express love in the way she needed, and hearing this softened something inside me, but the mother quickly added that there was more, something that revealed his emotional state far more clearly than his trembling voice, something they had learned accidentally when their daughter forgot her phone on the dining table and a message from my son popped up. Not a hurtful message or a complaint but a long paragraph he never sent, saved only in his drafts. A message overflowing with confessions he didn't know how to express directly. Confessions about his anxiety, sleepless nights, fears of failure, and the burden of expectations he had been carrying alone, and as they read that unsent message, they realized that my son, just like their daughter, was suffering quietly under layers of guilt, pressure, and emotional patterns he never learned to articulate, and when the father explained this, my throat tightened because I remembered how my son used to withdraw into silence whenever life overwhelmed him, how he learned early on that expressing fear or sadness was a sign of weakness, and I never realized how much that upbringing had shaped his behavior in adulthood, especially in marriage, where emotional vulnerability is not a luxury, it's a necessity. And as I listened to them describe his hidden anxiety, I felt my heart ache with the realization that both families had unknowingly passed down emotional habits that shaped their children in ways none of us intended, and now those inherited habits were colliding in a marriage that was trying to survive on two tired hearts carrying too much history. And as they continued, the mother revealed something that struck me deeper than anything said before. She confessed that their daughter had been trying to protect my son from judgment, telling them repeatedly not to misunderstand him, insisting that he wasn't cold or careless but simply emotionally overwhelmed, and that she believed he loved her more than he ever managed to show. And hearing that reminded me of all the times my daughter-in-law tried to maintain peace between families even when she was hurting, all the times she smiled through her exhaustion, all the times her eyes revealed a sadness she never expressed openly. And I realized then that emotional pain often binds people more tightly than emotional joy, because pain forces people into silence where words fail them. And when the father saw the expression on my face, he leaned back and said quietly that the real issue wasn't who was right or who was wrong, it was that both children were emotionally inexperienced in different ways, carrying different wounds shaped by their upbringing, and that their inability to communicate honestly had allowed small misunderstandings to grow into unbearable tensions. And I knew he was right, because marriages don't fall apart when love disappears, they fall apart when emotional safety is lost, when expressing needs becomes frightening, when vulnerability feels dangerous, and when silence becomes the default language of the relationship. And as I absorbed all this, the mother added another layer to the truth, something that revealed just how deeply their daughter had been trying to hold the marriage together. She told me that their daughter had once asked them not to interfere at all, not because she didn't need support but because she believed that my son was on the verge of breaking emotionally and she didn't want to push him further. And that confession hit me like a wave because it showed how deeply she cared for him, how much she understood his internal battles even when he tried to hide them from everyone, including me. And in that moment I felt an overwhelming mix of guilt, sadness, and helplessness. Guilt because I had assumed my son was the strong one, sadness because both children were fighting their battles alone, and helplessness because no parent ever wants to see their child emotionally fragile. Yet I had missed all the signs, and before I could speak, the father continued explaining that there was another reason the hotel situation spiraled so suddenly into talk of divorce, and he revealed that earlier that day, during their heated call, my son had said something that triggered years of insecurity in their daughter, not because the words were cruel but because they were spoken in frustration, and frustration from someone you love hits differently, deeper, sharper, and more permanently than frustration from a stranger. And as they described this moment, I realized how tiny emotional missteps, spoken during moments of stress, can scar someone already hurting, and my heart ached knowing how easily my son could have said something he didn't truly mean, something that came from fear rather than resentment. And the mother then shared that after the call ended, their daughter broke down in a way they had never seen, her tears uncontrollable, her breathing shallow, her hands shaking as if the emotional weight finally cracked her strength. And seeing her like that scared them. It convinced them that something needed to change immediately, and that's why they escalated so quickly to the word divorce, not because they wanted separation but because they feared what staying in the current emotional climate would do to their daughter. And even though I understood their fear, part of me felt crushed knowing that my son's emotional struggle had been misinterpreted as indifference, and that his silence, instead of appearing as vulnerability, had appeared as coldness, and I knew that if I didn't intervene with clarity and empathy, both families would continue acting out of fear rather than understanding, and that would destroy not only the marriage but also the emotional health of everyone involved. And as they continued opening up, I realized that both families had reached their breaking point, and I knew then that I had to become the bridge between them. I had to speak to my son and uncover his truth, not with blame or anger but with the compassion that he had always needed yet rarely received. And at that moment, as the weight of all these revelations settled around us like a storm we were standing in the center of, the mother suddenly touched my hand and said softly that what they were about to share next was something they had debated telling me, something that might hurt me but was necessary if healing was going to happen. And my heart tightened as I prepared myself for a truth I wasn't sure I was ready to hear. Because sometimes the answers we desperately seek are the very truths that break us, and as I nodded for them to continue, bracing myself internally, I felt the atmosphere around us shift into something heavier, something deeper, something that carried the power to reshape everything I believed about my son, my daughter-in-law, and the fragile psychological structure of their marriage that was now hanging by a single thread, waiting for someone brave enough to hold it together before it snapped completely. When they finally gathered the courage to share the next truth, a silence fell between us so heavy that even the buzzing of the hotel lights felt distant, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for the words that would come next. And the father looked directly into my eyes with an expression I had never seen before, a mixture of sympathy and hesitation, and he began explaining that their daughter had not simply been overwhelmed by marriage but by something she had discovered about my son, something she wasn't angry about but deeply confused and frightened by. And he told me that months earlier, during one of their calm evenings at home, she had noticed my son distancing himself emotionally in subtle ways, withdrawing into long silences, avoiding conversations, losing focus, and even forgetting important things he never used to forget. And at first she thought it was stress from work, but slowly she realized there was a pattern, a shift in his behavior that didn't match his usual personality. And on one particular night, when she gently asked if something was wrong, he had brushed her off with a forced smile, saying he was fine, but his eyes betrayed a storm he was trying desperately to hide. And later that night, when he couldn't sleep, he went into the living room, thinking she was asleep, but she followed him quietly and saw him sitting on the edge of the sofa with his face buried in his hands, trembling, not crying loudly but shaking the way someone shakes when they've been holding fear inside for too long. And that image haunted her, not because she felt betrayed but because she had never seen him that vulnerable, and it scared her how alone he felt in that moment. So alone that he couldn't even confide in the woman he promised his life to. And as the mother narrated this, her voice quivered because she said her daughter had described it as the moment she realized her husband was carrying a secret burden, one that was slowly eating away at him from the inside, and she didn't know how to help him without breaking him further. And I felt my own heart tighten because I knew exactly what that looked like. I had seen glimpses of that same silent suffering in my son when he was younger. The way he hid his challenges, the way he pretended everything was fine even when it clearly wasn't, the way he learned to wear strength like armor even when it cut into him. And then the father said something that froze my breath. He revealed that their daughter had discovered messages on my son's phone, not messages from another woman, not betrayal, nothing immoral or deceitful, but long unsent notes in his drafts addressed to himself, messages filled with words like "I can't keep up. I feel like I'm failing everyone. I don't know how to explain this to her. And what if I lose her because I can't be what she needs?" And these unsent confessions terrified her because she realized he was battling internal pressure so intense that it was slowly eroding his confidence, his identity, and even his ability to communicate. And she didn't know whether to confront him, comfort him, or give him space, because everything she did felt wrong and everything she didn't do felt worse. And as the mother described her daughter reading those messages with trembling hands, tears falling onto the phone screen, I felt my own heartbreak because those were the silent wounds my son had carried since childhood, wounds he never knew how to share. Wounds created by expectations, comparisons, responsibilities, and the unspoken belief that men aren't allowed to show weakness. And now those wounds had followed him into marriage, affecting not just his emotional well-being but the stability of their relationship. And then the father added that their daughter wasn't angry at him for hiding his struggles, she was heartbroken that he didn't trust her enough to share them. And that heartbreak made her question whether she truly belonged in his emotional world or whether she was merely someone he loved but couldn't open his heart to, and that question began spiraling inside her until it grew into a fear she couldn't silence, a fear that maybe the marriage was built on love but not communication, on loyalty but not emotional safety, and she tried again and again to bring him closer, to make him talk, to show him that vulnerability wouldn't make him weak, but every time he shut down, she interpreted his silence as distance, not. Realizing that he was fighting his own internal battles he was terrified to verbalize, and hearing all of this crushed me because I realized how many times I had unknowingly reinforced in him the idea that strength meant silence. How often I told him to handle things on his own, to act mature, to be responsible, to be the strong one, and now those lessons were hurting not just him but someone who loved him deeply, someone who wanted to be part of his struggles, not just his victories. And before I could fully process this revelation, the mother continued, explaining that the argument earlier that day wasn't triggered by disrespect but by fear from both sides, my son's fear of losing her and her fear of being emotionally shut out. And when emotions collide without communication, even a harmless misunderstanding can explode into disaster. And that's exactly what happened during the phone call, because when she asked him again if he was okay, he responded sharply, not out of anger toward her but out of frustration with himself, frustration that he couldn't express what was consuming him, and his tone, though unintentional, cut her deeply because it confirmed her worst fear, that he didn't want her inside the emotional world he kept locked away. And when she cried after the call, her parents panicked because they saw her break in a way no parent ever wants to see, and that was when their protective instinct pushed them toward the idea of divorce, not because they believed the marriage was hopeless but because they believed their daughter was slowly losing herself in an emotional labyrinth where she could neither reach her husband nor escape her pain. And as I listened, I felt a storm of emotions tearing through me. Pain for my son who was drowning silently, pain for my daughter-in-law who was reaching for him with trembling hands, and pain for myself for allowing generational patterns to grow into consequences I never intended. And the father then said that the only reason they were telling me all of this was because they believed that if anyone could reach my son, if anyone could break through his walls of fear and silence, it was me, not as a mother defending her child but as someone who understood the roots of his behavior, and their trust in me felt like both a responsibility and a burden, because I knew that talking to him would require strength, gentleness, and courage, and that if I handled it wrong, everything could collapse beyond repair. And as I sat there absorbing every word, I realized something profound. This entire crisis wasn't about disrespect, or arguments, or family differences. It was about two emotionally wounded people trying to love each other through inherited habits that neither of them understood, and now it was my turn to step into the storm, not to take sides, not to defend or blame, but to find the truth inside my son's silence. And as I stood up slowly, preparing to leave the hotel and confront the reality waiting outside, the mother whispered one last thing, something that echoed in my mind long after I left. She said that if I didn't reach him soon, he might break in ways that no one could fix, and that fear, that fragile truth, became the force that pushed me toward the most difficult conversation I would ever have with my son. As I left the hotel lobby and stepped into the crisp air outside, my mind was racing with every detail the in-laws had shared, every trembling confession, every silent plea for understanding. And I realized that the responsibility I now carried was not only for my son's well-being but also for the fragile emotional state of his wife and the family dynamics that had led us to this precarious moment. Because what seemed like a simple dispute over a hotel visit was, in truth, a psychological storm that had been brewing for months, a storm fueled by unspoken fears, hidden anxieties, unexpressed expectations, and generational emotional patterns that both children had inherited. And as I drove back toward my son's home, I replayed in my mind every word, every nuance, every moment when subtle signs had been missed, every time I had assumed strength was silence and resilience meant hiding one's vulnerabilities, and I felt a sharp pang of guilt because, like many parents, I had unintentionally taught my son to contain his pain instead of expressing it, and those lessons, though well-intentioned, had compounded over time to create an emotional distance in his marriage that neither he nor his wife could bridge alone. And I knew that addressing this required delicacy, empathy, and an understanding of psychological principles, because human behavior, especially within intimate relationships, is rarely linear, rarely simple, and often misunderstood even by those who live through it. And when I finally entered the house and saw my son sitting alone in the living room, I noticed immediately the subtle signs of tension, the tightness in his jaw, the restless tapping of his fingers, the way his eyes avoided mine. Not out of guilt but out of an inability to confront the emotional truth he had been suppressing for so long. And I felt a surge of both compassion and urgency because the moment to speak was fragile. One wrong word could trigger defensiveness. One misplaced gesture could shut him down, and one misunderstanding could escalate the psychological pressure he had been carrying for months. And as I sat across from him, I began by speaking softly, not to accuse, not to question, but to gently acknowledge the burden I could sense in him, the unseen weight pressing against his chest, the anxiety that had silenced him for far too long. And I told him that I had spoken with his in-laws, not to reprimand or punish him but to understand the broader emotional context, to see the full picture, and his eyes widened, a mixture of fear and relief washing over him as he realized that someone was finally trying to understand rather than judge. And then I described, without embellishment, what his wife had been experiencing, how she had been silently struggling, how the emotional distance he unintentionally created had been magnified by generational patterns, and how both families had contributed to a climate where communication failed. And as he listened, I noticed subtle changes, the rigid lines of his face softening, his shoulders loosening, the trembling in his hands quieting just slightly. And in that moment I understood the power of empathy, the transformative potential of being heard without judgment. Because when a person is understood, even minimally, their psychological defenses start to relax, their mind begins to organize chaos, and their emotional center regains a fragile stability. And I continued, carefully explaining that marriage is less about grand gestures and more about consistent, small, emotionally attuned actions, that listening is sometimes more powerful than speaking, that vulnerability is a strength rather than a weakness, and that emotional honesty, though uncomfortable, is essential to prevent silent suffering from taking root. And I noticed him nodding, small gestures at first, but gradually more confident. And then I asked him about the unsent messages his wife's parents had discovered, the confessions he had never dared to share, and he hesitated, his voice barely above a whisper, confessing that writing them had been a way to organize his thoughts, to process his anxiety, to give form to emotions he didn't know how to express verbally, and that reading them aloud now, even indirectly through me, felt both terrifying and liberating. And I reassured him that expressing these vulnerabilities would not make him less of a man, less of a husband, or less of a person, that in fact, confronting these emotions with honesty could strengthen the relationship, create new understanding, and prevent emotional isolation. And then I guided him through a mental exercise, encouraging him to imagine stepping into his wife's perspective, to feel the loneliness, the subtle fear, the longing to be understood. And I could see his eyes welling up with tears of frustration, realization, and relief, because understanding someone else's suffering often triggers one's own unexpressed emotions. And when he finally spoke, his voice cracking but steadying with each word, he apologized, not for mistakes or conflict, but for not recognizing her pain sooner, for remaining silent when emotional connection was needed, for letting generational patterns dictate his emotional availability rather than consciously shaping it. And as he spoke, I realized that this was the turning point, the moment where psychological awareness began to replace fear, where empathy replaced defensiveness, where silence started to transform into dialogue. And after what felt like hours but was likely only minutes, I encouraged him to reach out to his wife, not with arguments, explanations, or excuses, but with honesty, vulnerability, and reassurance. And I offered to mediate, to help them communicate safely without triggering defensiveness, to ensure that the psychological walls that had been built over months of miscommunication could start to be dismantled thoughtfully and with care. And then he paused, took a deep breath, and finally agreed, admitting that he had been terrified of losing her, that he had been trying to handle everything alone, that he had never realized how much his silence had hurt her. And I felt a surge of cautious hope, because acknowledgement is the first step toward meaningful emotional repair. And I reminded him that emotional safety is mutual, that both partners carry wounds, that both are influenced by upbringing, and that building a marriage capable of surviving stress requires conscious effort, patience, and empathy from both sides. And as he absorbed this, I could see a shift, subtle but profound, the tension in his body releasing, the storm in his eyes calming, a readiness to confront not just his own emotions but the shared emotional reality of their relationship. And as I prepared to call his wife, I reminded him that honesty doesn't mean over-explaining, that vulnerability doesn't mean weakness. That emotional courage is about opening the heart even when it's frightening, and that this moment, though small in appearance, could very well determine the trajectory of the rest of their marriage. And as we dialed the phone together, I realized that the hours of listening, reflection, and psychological understanding at the hotel and in this living room had created a rare space for transformation, a space where silent suffering could finally begin to be voiced, and that sometimes, one conversation, if conducted with care, empathy, and deep understanding, can shift the course of relationships more than years of avoidance, pretension, or miscommunication ever could. And I knew that what would happen next depended on both my son's courage and his wife's willingness to engage in authentic emotional dialogue. And as the phone rang, my mind raced with anticipation, fear, and hope, because this call wasn't just a conversation, it was the potential bridge between two hearts that had been lost in silence for far too long. The moment the phone connected, a tense silence filled the room, thicker than any I had ever experienced, because both my son and his wife were stepping into an emotional minefield, a place where every word carried weight, every pause could trigger misunderstanding, and every tone had the potential to unravel months of built-up tension. And I observed carefully, knowing that this conversation would set the tone for what might be the most crucial emotional exchange of their lives, and I encouraged my son to begin slowly, to speak not with defensiveness or explanation, but with acknowledgement and empathy. And he hesitated at first, his fingers gripping the edge of the sofa, his voice a low murmur, but then he started, admitting that he had been struggling, that he hadn't known how to express what he was feeling, that he had internalized stress, fear, and frustration, and that in doing so, he had unintentionally hurt her. And as he spoke, I could feel the invisible tension between them beginning to shift, the heavy weight of unspoken words lifting slightly as his wife responded with tentative acknowledgement, her voice soft but trembling, expressing that she too had been struggling, that she had felt alone, unseen, and emotionally distant from the person she loved most. And as their voices interwove across the phone line, I realized something profound about the psychology of marriage, that emotional honesty, even when painful, can catalyze understanding in ways that no reasoning or argument ever could. And I could hear both of them struggling, not with anger, but with fear, fear of vulnerability, fear of miscommunication, fear of being misunderstood. And I reminded my son gently that his role was not to defend but to listen, not to justify but to empathize. And as he repeated her words in his mind, truly hearing them, I could sense him softening, his psychological walls beginning to crumble in favor of authentic connection. And the mother on the other end of the line added that she had feared reaching out because she didn't want to confront him too harshly, but in the controlled, empathetic environment we had created, she could finally speak, finally express what she had carried silently. And as he listened, I noticed subtle changes in his posture, the tension in his jaw easing, the restless tapping of his fingers slowing, a sign that even subtle psychological relief was beginning to take effect. And as minutes passed, they shared small confessions, tiny vulnerabilities, little emotional truths that had been suppressed for months, and with each revelation, the psychological distance between them decreased incrementally, because hearing one's pain acknowledged can create a sense of safety that words alone cannot describe. And I realized that this was the moment when their marriage was no longer about individual fear but about shared understanding, shared emotional reality, and a mutual willingness to repair and rebuild. And I encouraged them to continue speaking, to maintain calm, to avoid blaming language, to focus instead on expressing feelings and needs. And slowly, their dialogue shifted from defensive to collaborative, from fearful to hopeful. And I saw the beginnings of emotional alignment, the subtle convergence of two people learning to meet each other halfway, to bridge the gaps that had accumulated over months of miscommunication and unspoken expectation. And I could feel my own emotional tension release slightly as I observed them finding each other again, not in grand gestures or dramatic confessions, but in small, authentic exchanges that carried the weight of honesty, empathy, and courage. And I reminded them both that this was just the beginning, that rebuilding trust and emotional intimacy is a process, a continuous practice of listening, understanding, and responding with care, and that even after this conversation, they would encounter challenges, moments of stress, and opportunities for miscommunication, but the psychological foundation they were beginning to create now, through honesty, acknowledgement, and vulnerability, was far stronger than anything they had built in silence. And as the call continued, I could hear my son beginning to express gratitude, gratitude for her patience, for her love, for her willingness to reach out even when she felt hurt, and his wife began to express appreciation for his courage, his willingness to listen, and his openness in sharing, and in those small expressions, the emotional tide shifted significantly, because gratitude, acknowledgement, and empathy are among the most powerful psychological tools to repair relationships, to heal emotional wounds, and to foster long-term trust. And I encouraged them both to reflect on what they had just accomplished, to internalize the lesson that emotional honesty does not weaken bonds but strengthens them, and that being psychologically vulnerable is not a sign of failure but of strength and commitment. And as they continued, their dialogue became more fluid, more responsive, less fearful, and I could feel the cumulative effect of these exchanges beginning to manifest in a subtle but powerful way: relief, a release of tension, and the first real sense of mutual understanding they had experienced in months. And I reminded my son that listening carefully is as important as speaking honestly. That understanding her perspective fully before responding ensures that communication becomes a bridge rather than a barrier, and that acknowledging his own emotional struggles openly can invite her empathy rather than her judgment. And as they spoke, I observed both of them breathing more steadily, voices more confident, expressions softening, and the silent psychological walls that had defined their interactions began to erode in favor of connection, which reminded me of the profound influence parents can have on adult emotional patterns, both positive and negative, and how breaking generational cycles of suppressed emotion requires conscious effort, mindfulness, and empathy. And I knew that the conversation we were having right now, though seemingly simple, represented a critical inflection point in their psychological and emotional development as a couple, because through deliberate communication, acknowledgement, and empathy, they were learning skills that could reshape the trajectory of their marriage entirely. And I encouraged them to continue exploring each other's inner worlds, to validate feelings without judgment, to remain curious rather than reactive, and to remember that even small acts of emotional transparency can create compounding effects of trust and intimacy. And slowly, the tone of the conversation shifted from fear and uncertainty to cautious optimism, from tension to tentative connection, from isolation to the awareness of being emotionally present for each other. And as the call finally ended, I could feel a palpable change in both their psychological states, a subtle yet profound shift that reflected hope, recognition, and the first genuine alignment of understanding. And I realized that although the path ahead would still be challenging, this moment had set the stage for healing, emotional growth, and renewed intimacy. And it underscored a critical truth about the psychology of marriage: that silence may protect temporarily, but honest dialogue heals permanently, and that understanding and empathy, when applied consistently, are far more powerful than any argument, any blame, or any avoidance could ever be. And as I watched my son set down the phone, a mixture of relief and determination in his eyes, I knew that this was the turning point, the beginning of a conscious effort to break old emotional patterns, to repair trust, and to cultivate a marriage rooted in shared psychological understanding, emotional honesty, and mutual vulnerability. And as we sat together in quiet reflection, I silently acknowledged the power of intervention, listening, and guidance, and I realized that even one conversation, carefully conducted, can create ripples that extend far beyond the immediate moment, shaping relationships, restoring hope, and creating the foundation for long-term psychological resilience. After witnessing the subtle but powerful shift in my son's demeanor following that phone call, I realized that the next critical step was helping him internalize the lessons of empathy, vulnerability, and emotional honesty. Because the psychology of relationships demonstrates repeatedly that temporary understanding without ongoing practice rarely sustains itself, and I knew that if he returned to old habits of emotional withdrawal, silence, or avoidance, the fragile bridge we had built today could collapse almost instantly, undoing hours of progress and reinforcing the patterns that had nearly destroyed his marriage. And so I began guiding him through a reflective process, encouraging him to examine not only the immediate causes of tension with his wife but also the deeper emotional triggers within himself, the fears he carried from childhood, the unspoken expectations he had inherited from his family, and the learned behaviors that made him believe that strength meant silence, resilience meant avoidance, and love meant sacrifice without disclosure. And as he considered these elements, I prompted him to visualize alternative approaches, to imagine expressing vulnerability while maintaining his dignity, to picture listening actively without defensiveness, to see himself acknowledging mistakes without shame, and to rehearse emotionally honest interactions that could prevent misunderstandings before they escalated into crises. And I could sense the wheels turning in his mind as he weighed these strategies, considering how his emotional patterns intersected with his wife's experiences, her fears, her unspoken expectations, and her methods of coping with emotional distance. And as we explored these dimensions together, I reminded him that psychology teaches us that human behavior in intimate relationships is often cyclical, that one person's withdrawal triggers the other's withdrawal, that small negative interactions accumulate into systemic relational problems, and that interrupting these cycles requires conscious awareness, deliberate communication, and repeated reinforcement. And I noticed him nodding subtly, absorbing the idea that being proactive in emotional dialogue was not optional but essential, and that he had the power to change relational dynamics if he chose to engage courageously rather than retreating into familiar defensive habits. And as I spoke, I observed the way his hands relaxed, the tension in his shoulders eased, the tight lines around his eyes softened, a physiological reflection of cognitive and emotional integration taking place. And I knew that the body often signals psychological change before the conscious mind fully comprehends it, which confirmed for me that these interventions, though subtle, were resonating at multiple levels simultaneously. And then I introduced the concept of mutual emotional validation, explaining that when partners actively acknowledge each other's feelings without immediate judgment or corrective advice, the brain responds with decreased stress signals, increased oxytocin release, and enhanced capacity for trust and collaboration. And as he absorbed this, I encouraged him to practice phrases and responses that could convey understanding and reassurance to his wife, emphasizing that emotional intelligence is a learned skill, not an innate trait, and that consistent practice could gradually reshape both partners' experience of the relationship, reducing fear, anxiety, and reactive conflict. And as we continued, I guided him through imagining scenarios where small miscommunications might arise, and how he could respond calmly, reflectively, and empathetically, transforming potential triggers into opportunities for emotional connection rather than conflict escalation. And he began to articulate his own fears aloud: fear of being judged, fear of inadequacy, fear of losing the woman he loved. And I reinforced that articulating these fears did not diminish his masculinity but demonstrated emotional courage, and that by sharing these internal experiences responsibly, he could invite intimacy and mutual understanding, rather than unintentionally erecting walls of isolation and silence. And then I asked him to consider his wife's psychological perspective once more, to truly imagine the impact of his previous emotional withdrawal on her daily life, her sense of security, her perception of being valued and heard. And as he engaged in this exercise, I could see a deepening awareness in his eyes, a dawning recognition of the emotional reciprocity that governs healthy relationships. And I explained that the human mind responds profoundly to being seen, understood, and emotionally validated. That neuropsychology supports the idea that emotional attunement can alter stress responses, reduce conflict-driven cortisol spikes, and strengthen relational bonds, and that even subtle expressions of empathy, repeated consistently, can rewire relational patterns over time. And he listened intently, the weight of his prior unawareness slowly giving way to a sense of agency, a realization that he could actively shape the emotional climate of his marriage rather than feeling helpless or passive. And then I invited him to plan a concrete next step, a conversation with his wife where he would express acknowledgement of her experience, share his own vulnerabilities responsibly, commit to proactive emotional communication, and ask for collaborative solutions rather than unilateral explanations. And as he outlined the steps aloud, his voice gaining clarity and steadiness, I could see the psychological shift that occurs when awareness meets intention, when insight translates into deliberate action. And I reminded him that sustaining this change would require ongoing attention, reflection, and adaptation, because even the most well-intentioned individuals fall back into old habits under stress, and that establishing a pattern of conscious emotional responsiveness, reinforcement of trust, and empathetic dialogue would be the key to preventing regression. And as we reviewed potential obstacles, I encouraged him to develop internal cues and reminders, to pause before reacting, to breathe, to validate feelings internally before responding externally, and to model patience, empathy, and consistency, because these strategies are supported by decades of relational psychology research, and when applied consistently, they dramatically reduce conflict escalation, enhance attachment security, and create environments where both partners feel safe, respected, and valued. And as he practiced articulating his commitments aloud, I could see his posture straighten, his gaze steady, the tension lines in his face soften, and a sense of psychological empowerment radiating from him, the internalization of cognitive, emotional, and behavioral strategies creating a palpable shift in his readiness to engage in authentic, restorative communication. And as I concluded this reflective session, I reminded him that the ultimate goal was not perfection, not the absence of conflict, but the consistent practice of emotional honesty, attentive listening, and empathetic responsiveness, and that by consciously shaping his own behaviors while acknowledging his wife's experience, he could transform the relational dynamics, prevent silent suffering, and cultivate a marriage capable of resilience, intimacy, and mutual psychological growth. And as we sat in quiet reflection, I felt the cumulative weight of the previous day's revelations, conversations, and interventions settle into a hopeful, actionable plan, a roadmap for emotional repair, and I realized that this moment, though challenging, marked a profound turning point, one where understanding, empathy, and conscious relational practice could begin to override the patterns of silence, misunderstanding, and emotional isolation that had nearly led to the collapse of their marriage. The following day, I observed my son in a new light, the subtle psychological transformation from the previous interventions becoming increasingly visible. Because although external behaviors can change temporarily under guidance, true internalization requires both conscious reflection and the ongoing presence of self-awareness. And I noticed him approaching interactions with his wife more deliberately, pausing before responding, listening with attention rather than reaction, validating her concerns, and articulating his own emotions with clarity and courage. And I reflected on the psychological principles underpinning these changes, recognizing that emotional intelligence, once dormant or underdeveloped, can expand dramatically when supported by safe spaces, empathetic dialogue, and careful modeling of behavior. And as I watched him navigate small daily conversations with attentiveness and patience, I realized the depth of the challenge they had faced, that months of accumulated misunderstanding, unspoken fears, and generationally inherited emotional habits had created a dense web of psychological complexity in their marriage. And yet, with incremental adjustments, conscious practice, and guided reflection, these patterns were now beginning to unravel, allowing space for trust, emotional attunement, and vulnerability to flourish. And I reflected further on the cumulative effect of empathy, acknowledging that when one partner consistently demonstrates understanding, responsiveness, and openness, the psychological atmosphere shifts, creating safety cues for the other partner to reciprocate, which reinforces attachment, reduces stress, and fosters resilience in the relationship. And I saw this effect occurring in my son, as he gradually integrated insights into his daily interactions, responding not defensively but reflectively, actively seeking to understand before responding, and articulating concerns without projecting fear or blame. And I noted that his wife, in response, began mirroring these behaviors, softening her own defenses, expressing her emotional needs with greater confidence, and responding to his emerging vulnerabilities with empathy rather than judgment. And this reciprocal engagement was, in real time, reshaping the psychological patterns of their marriage, replacing cycles of silence and misinterpretation with dialogue and understanding. And I marveled at the subtle but profound power of conscious relational practice, where awareness, patience, and empathy become tools for repairing long-standing emotional fractures. And I continued to coach my son on reinforcement techniques, encouraging him to maintain emotional presence even in moments of stress, to pause before reacting to triggers, to use reflective listening consistently, to express appreciation and validation, and to recognize the compounding effects of small, repeated acts of emotional attentiveness, because research in psychology demonstrates that relational resilience is strengthened more by repeated micro-behaviors than by occasional grand gestures. And as I observed these patterns solidifying, I reflected on the critical role of insight, the understanding of how one's own upbringing, personal fears, and internalized patterns influence reactions, emotional availability, and relational dynamics. And I discussed with him strategies for maintaining awareness under pressure, including mindfulness techniques, self-reflection prompts, and internal validation exercises to prevent regression into old habits. And as he practiced articulating these strategies, I could sense a new layer of psychological competence emerging, a conscious capacity to regulate both his emotions and his responses, and a readiness to co-create relational environments conducive to mutual growth. And I also reminded him that this process is iterative, that each conversation, each day presents opportunities to reinforce positive patterns or inadvertently reinforce old ones, and that sustained relational health requires consistent vigilance, emotional honesty, and empathy. And I noticed how these reflections affected his posture, facial expression, and tone, subtle indicators that the psychological lessons were integrating at a deeper level, influencing not only cognition but also effective response. And I emphasized that emotional repair is not linear, that setbacks will occur, that moments of defensiveness or misinterpretation are inevitable. But what matters is the conscious effort to return to understanding, to re-engage with empathy, and to maintain a focus on connection rather than winning arguments. And as he internalized this, I guided him through visualization exercises, imagining challenging conversations, potential conflicts, and misunderstandings, and rehearsing responses that were grounded in empathy, acknowledgement, and emotional responsibility. And this process allowed him to anticipate triggers, regulate his own emotions, and respond in ways that promoted psychological safety for both partners. And as these cognitive and emotional skills consolidated, I observed tangible behavioral shifts. He smiled more openly, maintained eye contact during discussions, responded calmly to emotional expressions, and initiated small but meaningful gestures of support and acknowledgement, all of which contributed to a sense of psychological safety for his wife. And I reflected on how deeply the principles of relational psychology, emotional intelligence, and attachment theory were being applied in real time, transforming not only their immediate interactions but also the underlying relational schema that had governed their marriage. And as the day progressed, I noticed both partners beginning to anticipate each other's emotional needs, to communicate proactively, to repair minor misunderstandings before escalation, and to reinforce trust through consistent, observable behavior. And I realized that these small but cumulative shifts were creating a feedback loop, one in which positive emotional engagement reinforced further openness, empathy, and attunement. And the psychological patterns that once predicted conflict were being replaced by patterns that predicted collaboration, understanding, and mutual support. And as I witnessed these transformations, I felt a profound sense of hope, because while the challenges they had faced were significant, the interventions, reflections, and deliberate practice of emotional intelligence were now catalyzing real change, demonstrating the remarkable capacity of human beings to learn, adapt, and repair, even in the midst of deep relational strain. And I knew that sustained progress would require ongoing commitment, mindfulness, and conscious engagement. But the foundation had been laid, and the trajectory was now one of growth, resilience, and relational flourishing. And as I reflected on the journey from the hotel confrontation to this moment, I recognized the vital importance of early intervention, empathetic listening, guided psychological reflection, and the consistent application of emotional intelligence in transforming relationships. And I felt both pride and cautious optimism, understanding that while the road ahead would present challenges, the tools, awareness, and behaviors now in place significantly increased the probability of not just salvaging, but strengthening, their marriage over the long term. As the days passed after our intensive interventions, I observed a remarkable shift not only in my son and his wife but in the entire psychological atmosphere of their relationship, because what had once been dominated by silence, unspoken fear, and miscommunication was gradually transforming into an environment of conscious emotional engagement. And I realized that the combination of empathy, guided reflection, vulnerability, and deliberate behavioral practice was producing a profound recalibration of relational dynamics, one that could now support resilience, intimacy, and mutual psychological growth. And I reminded my son that the journey was ongoing, that real change requires sustained attention, deliberate reinforcement of new patterns, and the courage to revisit challenging conversations when old fears arise, because even the most committed partners can regress without conscious effort. And as he absorbed this, I encouraged him to develop a relational maintenance plan, outlining daily check-ins, shared reflections, acknowledgement of each other's emotions, and intentional practices of appreciation, validation, and empathy, all grounded in psychological principles that promote secure attachment, trust, and long-term relational satisfaction. And I observed his wife responding with increasing openness and willingness to share her feelings, to recognize the positive changes in her husband, and to collaborate in reinforcing a climate of safety, understanding, and connection. And as both of them began applying these strategies, I saw firsthand the compounding effect of consistent emotional intelligence in action, where each act of vulnerability, acknowledgement, or empathetic listening created reinforcing loops of trust, reduced anxiety, and strengthened emotional bonds. And I reflected on how critical it is for parents, mentors, and guides to intervene thoughtfully in moments of relational crisis, not to control outcomes but to provide tools, perspective, and psychological scaffolding for individuals to regain clarity, insight, and agency. And I considered how often marriages falter not because of lack of love but because of the absence of emotional literacy, the inability to navigate inner fears, and the accumulation of misinterpretations and unexpressed anxieties. And in this case, the guided interventions had illuminated both the hidden burdens my son carried and the unspoken pain his wife endured, enabling them to reconstruct the relational framework from a foundation of understanding rather than misjudgment. And I watched as they began to communicate not only more openly but more thoughtfully, using active listening, reflective feedback, emotional labeling, and collaborative problem-solving, which are all supported by decades of psychological research on relationship resilience. And as they practiced these skills in real-life interactions, I noticed changes in nonverbal communication, tone modulation, and emotional responsiveness that signaled genuine internalization of the principles we had discussed. And it became clear that their marriage was entering a phase where conscious emotional regulation, vulnerability, and mutual empathy could prevent future escalations of conflict, reduce the likelihood of misinterpretation, and foster deeper intimacy. And I reflected on the powerful role of parental guidance when delivered with empathy, patience, and psychological insight, not as interference but as a bridge to understanding. Because often adult children need external perspectives to recognize patterns that they cannot see while emotionally enmeshed in the relationship. And as the evening progressed, I encouraged my son to maintain gratitude practices, to notice and affirm his wife's efforts, to acknowledge small acts of care, and to remain aware of his own triggers, ensuring that every interaction contributed positively to the relational climate rather than unconsciously perpetuating old cycles. And I reminded him that these strategies are not just reactive but preventative, reducing stress, anxiety, and the likelihood of emotional withdrawal by continuously reinforcing trust, connection, and attunement. And I could see that the psychological shift was taking hold, as both partners were now more attuned to each other's emotional states, more responsive to subtle cues, and increasingly comfortable with expressing vulnerabilities without fear of judgment or rejection. And as we reflected on this progress, I realized the importance of not only repairing relational fractures but also teaching lifelong skills of emotional intelligence, self-awareness, and relational mindfulness that could support them through future challenges. And I emphasized that maintaining this growth requires consistent reflection, practice, and intentionality, because without it, the patterns of miscommunication, withdrawal, and silent suffering could re-emerge under stress. And I observed my son acknowledging this responsibility, demonstrating not only understanding but commitment, and I saw his wife responding with renewed trust and hope. And in that shared psychological space, I recognized the profound potential for transformation when insight, empathy, and deliberate action converge. And as we concluded this phase of intervention, I encouraged them to continue building their marriage through intentional, empathetic dialogue, proactive emotional regulation, and mutual support. And I reminded them that the foundation they were creating now would influence not only their present well-being but also their future resilience, the emotional patterns they pass to their children, and the legacy of relational intelligence in their family. And finally, reflecting on the entire journey from the shocking hotel incident to this point of renewed understanding, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction, knowing that through patience, empathy, psychological insight, and deliberate action, it is possible to transform conflict, anxiety, and misunderstanding into emotional growth, strengthened intimacy, and enduring relational resilience. And now, as I share this story with you, the viewer, I want you to pause and reflect on your own relationships. Consider the power of emotional honesty, vulnerability, and empathy, and understand that even in moments of tension or conflict, deliberate communication, active listening, and acknowledgement of unspoken fears can transform dynamics and foster deeper connection. And if you found value in this journey, if you recognize the importance of emotional awareness in your own life, then take a step today. Communicate openly with someone you love, reflect on your own emotional patterns, and practice empathy consistently. And if you want more insights, strategies, and real-life psychological interventions like this that can reshape your relationships, hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a guide to emotional intelligence, because your commitment to understanding yourself and others is the first step toward meaningful change, connection, and lasting happiness.